In July 2001, 4 helicopters rose above a small island 430 miles south of New Zealand. The sun shines here for less than 2 hours a day. It rains almost every day, and the last residents left back in the 90s. The island drops into the ocean in a sheer 1,000-foot wall. From the surf line to the peaks, Norway rats had taken it over. By some estimates, as many as 200,000 of them. Rats packed that tightly have never been found anywhere else in the world. In 1 month, every acre of the island had to be covered with bait, down to the last gully and the last ledge. 130 tons of poison pellets and 1 surviving pregnant female would have been enough to start the whole thing over within a few years. 2 years later, people came back to the island with traps and a dog trained to find rodents by smell. They found no rats, but there were bird tracks in the mud along the shore. Nobody had a camera, so they sketched the tracks by hand and radioed the description to an ornithologist. The answer came back: these tracks cannot be here. The bird that left them is one of the rarest on the planet, and no one had ever seen it on this island. The island is called Campbell. It sits in the belt of ocean that sailors nicknamed the Furious 50s. The wind here blows almost without a break, and there is nowhere to hide from it. The yearly average is around 43 degrees Fahrenheit, and even in summer, it rarely gets warmer than 54. The island is mountainous, its peaks rising almost 2,000 feet, and a long inlet cuts so deep inland that it nearly splits the land in two. There are no tall trees here. Along the water grow low thickets, twisted by the wind and always wet. The only way through them is straight ahead. Higher up the slopes come tough grasses, and among them rise the megaherbs, huge flowers with leaves almost 3 feet across. 40% of the island's invertebrates live nowhere else on Earth. On January 4th, 1810, a sealing brig called the Perseverance came up to the shore. The inlet it sailed into was named after it. The brig's captain, Frederick Hasselborough, was looking for new seal colonies. The first scientists got here only 30 years later, aboard the Erebus and the Terror, the same ships that would later vanish in the Arctic with the Franklin expedition. Once ashore, the first thing they noted was something odd. There were almost no land birds on the island. The researchers thought they were describing the island's wildlife. In fact, they were describing what was left of it. Before the ships came, there was not a single land mammal on Campbell. The birds had no one to hide from, so they nested right on the ground. Insects grew large and slowly lost the ability to fly. This went on for millions of years, until the Perseverance came back. In October 1828, the brig was wrecked there. Of all the ships that ever called here, it was the only one that went down. That is when the rats came ashore, off the wreck of the very ship that had discovered the island 18 years earlier. 12 years were enough. By the time the first scientists arrived, the rats had spread across the whole island. The land birds went first: the pipit, the snipe, and a flightless duck, the Campbell teal. Not one of them was left on Campbell itself, but nearby, several sheer rocks rise out of the water, and the rats could not reach them, so a few survivors held on there. Then came the turn of the small seabirds, the ones that raise their chicks in burrows: storm petrels, diving petrels, prions. Colonies of the bigger birds survived, but thinned out badly. And then the rats got down to the smallest of all, to the weta, big flightless insects that look like crickets, to giant slugs, to beetles, to plant seeds. Rats were even seen diving for mussels along the shore. They learned to eat almost everything the island had. Their numbers shifted with the seasons. In the good months, as many as 200,000 animals lived here. In the lean ones, about 50,000. This went on for more than 170 years. Rats were not Campbell's only problem. For almost 40 years, starting at the end of the 19th century, a sheep farm ran here. The plants were burned off now and then to make pasture, and about 7,000 sheep grazed the slopes. The same farmers brought in cats. In 1931, the last leaseholder left the island broke. The climate, the isolation, and a crash in wool prices had made the farm pointless. And in the middle of the 20th century, the island was made a reserve, with a plan to bring it back to the way it used to be. so the native plants and birds could take back the ground that the introduced animals had driven them from. And the first thing they went after was not the rats, but the sheep. The work began in the 70s and stretched out over more than 20 years. Twice the island was cut in half by a fence, one side was cleared, and then they watched what happened to the grass where the sheep were gone. Not everyone agreed with this, because the island's sheep were considered a rare and valuable breed. By 1991, there was not a single sheep left on Campbell, and the feral cattle had disappeared even earlier. The grass came back almost at once, the megaherbs rose again, and the tough tussocks spread across the slopes. And then, by the mid-90s, the cats disappeared too, all on their own. Nobody touched them. Derek Brown, who would later work on the rat operation, explains it this way. On short grass cropped down by sheep, a cat hunts easily, but it cannot push through tall, wet thickets. The cats were wet and cold all the time, stopped having kittens, and slowly died out. The sheep were taken off the island by people. The cats went on their own, but the rats outlasted them both. Before Campbell, no one in the world had tried to clear rats off an island this size. Earlier operations had covered areas several times smaller, and there was no room for error. One untreated gully would have meant starting all over, but the size was not even the hardest part. The poison they planned to use does not tell a rat from a bird, and the island was home to dozens of species that the whole thing was being done to save. They had to remove one species without touching the others, and almost every decision in this operation was made with that in mind. They started with a test. In 1999, they dropped bait with no poison in it at all on a small patch. Instead of poison, the pellets carried a harmless dye called rhodamine. If a rat ate a pellet, the dye showed up inside it afterward, and they found it in every rat caught on that patch, which meant the bait would reach them everywhere, in every kind of ground on the island. Then they cut down the amount of poison that would land on the island. Pellets like these are normally dropped in 2 passes, but here they made do with one and ran the strips overlapping, so half the usual amount of bait went down. The pellets themselves were dyed green because that color does not attract birds. They chose to make the drop in winter. At that time of year, most of the seabirds here stay out on the open ocean and do not come back to shore. 19 people and 4 helicopters took part in the whole operation. To make sure not one patch was missed, every flight followed a satellite track, and in the evening, the tracks were checked for gaps. The next morning, those spots were flown again. The hardest job went to Brian Beck. He flew along the sea cliffs, 50 to 65 feet from a sheer wall, and went over the same stretch several times so the pellets would lodge on the ledges and in the cracks where rats hide. In the same sky flew southern royal albatrosses, some of the largest flying birds on the planet, with wingspans over 10 feet. At low speed, they got out of the helicopter's way easily, but once a machine picked up speed, an albatross would stop judging the closing distance correctly, so the pilots flew slower on purpose. Not a single collision happened during the whole operation. 3 months had been set aside for the drop. That is how long it would take to wait out 60 hours of flying weather. But the weather that year turned out unusually good, and everything was finished in a month. In July 2001, some of the team got seriously worried at that point. It had gone too easily, and it felt to them like they had made a mistake somewhere. They would not know the answer for another 2 years. There was no point checking sooner. If any rats had survived on the island, they would only have reached noticeable numbers after 2 breeding seasons, and before that, nobody would have spotted them. So the first real check did not happen until 2003. 6 staff from the Department of Conservation landed here along with a dog named Jack, trained to find rats by scent. They lived here for a month, searched every old building, walked the shores and the slopes, and set out so many traps that together they stood for more than 4,000 nights. On the most used trails, they laid out sticks soaked in peanut oil. If any rats were still around, the smell would draw them in, and tooth marks would show up on the sticks. And then, in the buildings of the abandoned weather station, they found rat droppings. If they were fresh, it meant 130 tons of bait. 2 years of waiting, and more than $2.5 million had gone to waste. Everything they found was collected and sent for analysis, and traps were set inside the buildings, and no one touched them until the team left. The analysis showed clear traces of rhodamine, the same dye from the harmless bait. So the droppings were almost 4 years old, and all that time in the subantarctic cold, they had stayed as fresh as if they had been left the day before. Not one fresh trace was ever found on the island. At that point, it was the largest island in the world that had been completely cleared of rats. Campbell would not be officially declared free of them until 2006, but what they saw in 2003 was enough to start bringing the island's old residents home. Some of them, though, came back without waiting to be carried. On that very same trip, the researchers started finding things that had not been here for a long time. Weta, those same flightless insects, used to be rare on the island, but now a few minutes of searching was enough. They were picked out of the fallen leaves right by the hut and shaken out of the litter packed into the forks of the bushes. The island began recovering from the very bottom of the food chain, and then the birds came back. The pipits showed up first, the ones that had waited out all those years on the nearby rocks. They were seen 20 times over the trip, sometimes several at once, and noticeably more often in the southern part of the island, which meant they were flying home from the closest southern islets. The pipits were not the least bit afraid of the researchers, and those researchers were most likely the first people these birds had ever seen in their lives. But the most important thing happened somewhere other than Campbell. Just over half a mile to the south of it, Jacquemart rises out of the water, a rock of about 47 acres ringed by cliffs on every side, the southernmost land in New Zealand. There is no climbing it from the sea, and the first human being set foot on Jacquemart only in 1980, brought in by helicopter. In November of 1997, on only the third landing in history, 3 specialists came ashore with 3 search dogs. They were looking for the teal. The dogs found no teal. They found a snipe, a bird no one had ever come across before. Later, it would be recognized as a separate subspecies that lives here and nowhere else on Earth. Its ancestors had sat on that rock for about 170 years, ever since the rats took over the big island. The scientists had no doubt that bringing the bird home would be up to people. Trap it, breed it in captivity, get it ready, release it. 10 years of work, maybe 20. The snipe did not wait. It left those very tracks in the shoreline mud back in 2003, 2 years after the rats were gone. In March 2005, a fully feathered chick was caught on the shore across from Jacquemart, which meant the snipe were already raising young on Campbell itself. And in January 2006, more than 20 adult birds, 5 chicks, and an active nest were counted. The species did not get its name until January 2010, and they called it Perseverance, after the brig that once found this island. And on January 4th, exactly 200 years after the Perseverance came up to these shores, a grown snipe chick was photographed by the wooden boardwalk near the base. It was never trapped, never bred in captivity, never moved anywhere. The rats we brought here ourselves were taken off the island, and after that, nature managed on its own. To get to Campbell, the snipe had to fly just over half a mile. The next bird could not fly at all. The Campbell teal is a small dark duck, nocturnal and so secretive that almost nobody had ever seen one alive. A few of these birds came into the hands of scientists back in the 19th century, but for decades it stayed unclear whether Campbell had a separate species of its own. For about 100 years, the teal was considered extinct, and then live birds were found on Dent, a rock 2 miles from the island. On November 12, 1975, scientists landed there for the first time in history, caught one female, examined her, and let her go. Probably fewer than 50 birds were living on that whole rock. Waiting for flightless ducks to swim 2 miles of stormy ocean on their own was out of the question. 11 teal were taken to the North Island, to the Pukaha Mount Bruce Breeding Center, and the work began. The years went by, and there was not a single egg. Nobody knew anything about how these ducks live in the wild, and the keepers had to guess at the right conditions. The turning point came in 1994. A female named Daisy and a male named Donald finally paired up and hatched 2 ducklings. It was the first time in the world this species had bred in captivity. Of all the wild females that came into the center, only Daisy produced young. The entire captive line comes from her alone, and the genetic diversity of the species is still very low to this day. First, they tried releasing birds on a far-off island where predators were already gone. 2 small batches settled in with almost no losses. That meant the teal could be taken straight from the pens to Campbell. In September 2004, the first 50 headed home. The trip took almost 3 days, most of it by sea. The birds were examined, vaccinated, and fed through a tube. 2 more batches were brought in 2005 and 2006. 159 teal returned to the island in all. That ended a 20-year project. Breeding them in captivity was no longer needed. They were breeding on Campbell on their own. And it all started with 50 ducks on one single rock. Today, the Campbell teal is officially listed as a species that is increasing. And by some estimates, there are already close to 1,000 of these birds, though nobody has ever really tried to count such a secretive night bird. One surviving rat would have been enough to leave the island with no birds again. One surviving duck was enough to bring the birds back. Campbell Island did not go back to 1810. We do not even really know what it was like then. The first scientists got here after the rats. Not everything has recovered. Seabirds like the gray petrel need decades for that. And penguin numbers here depend on the ocean, not on rodents. But the weta turn up in the leaves under the bushes again. The pipits have flown in from the nearby rocks and are raising chicks right on the ground again because there is no one left here to touch them. The snipe has settled where it had not been seen for 170 years. The teal was brought in containers, and after that it managed on its own. On these 27,000 acres, there is now not a single introduced predator. The island belongs once again to the ones who lived on it before our ships came.